I want to bring to the podium a woman we've invited to join us tonight who is what I consider to be one of the leading experts on this entire process of these UN resolutions, these defamation resolutions, and now what is currently happening with UN Resolution 1618 and the Istanbul process. Deborah Weiss currently works for Vigilance, an organization dedicated to educating the public on terrorism-related causes. Previously, she was the Manhattan director for the Forbes for President campaign, served as a counsel for the Committee on House Oversight in Congress, and served as an assistant corporation counsel in the Giuliani administration. She is considered an expert in the defamation of religious resolutions and is a contributing author to the book, Saudi Arabia and the Global Islamic Terrorist Network. She is a regular contributor to the Washington Times and Front Page magazine. Ms. Weiss is also a survivor of the 9/11 terrorist attack in New York City. Deborah?
I want to thank Act for America for holding this event, and I want to thank everybody in the audience out there in the internet and the live audience here today for educating yourselves on this important and underreported matter. So I was asked to speak to you today about the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, or the OIC, and its UN resolutions to stifle criticism of all Islam-related topics. So first, who is the OIC? It is the second largest international organization in the world, behind only the UN. It is the largest Islamic organization in the world, claiming to represent 1.5 billion Muslims around the world. It's comprised of 56 UN member states, plus the Palestinian Authority, and they vote together as a bloc in the UN. They're absolutely the largest voting bloc in the Human Rights Council, and they're arguably the largest voting bloc in the UN as a whole, and yet most people have never heard of it. Previously, it was called the Organization of Islamic Conference, if you want to Google more information about them. But in 2011, they changed their name to the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. Their mission, however, remains identical to what it was previously. So I'll let you decide whether or not they're cooperating, and if so, with whom. The OIC holds itself out as a moderate organization, but let's be clear about the true nature of the OIC. It is an Islamist supremacist organization whose long-term vision is the worldwide implementation of Sharia law. Its top priorities are the supremacy of Islam and what's in the best interest of the Islamic Ummah. It's a community mentality totally at odds with Western notions of individual freedom and individual liberty. It is through this framework, through the lens of Sharia law, that all ideas set forth by the OIC must be analyzed. Its ultimate goal is the international criminalization of all speech that's critical of Islamic theocracies, of Islam, of Muslims, of Sharia law, and even Islamic terrorism. Knowing this can't occur overnight, it introduces the language in a watered-down form and targets UN bodies and EU parliamentary legislation in order to achieve its goals gradually and incrementally. Under the guise of responsible speech, sensitive speech, or politically correct speech, what the OIC really wants to do is to stifle your freedom of speech. The first resolution I'm going to discuss with you today is called Combating Defamation of Islam, or defamation of religions for short. Originally, it was called Defamation of Islam, but when it failed to get sufficient support, they changed the name of it to Defamation of Religions. Yet, in the text of the body of the resolution, the only religion singled out by mention is Islam. It also takes numerous assumptions and asserts them as fact. Without any hearings, without any debate, and without any investigation, this resolution asserts that Islam is wrongly associated with terrorism, it's wrongly associated with human rights violations, and that there's been undue backlash against Muslims ever since 9/11. For those of you unfamiliar with the concept of combating defamation of religions, what it does is it takes an idea or a religion, in this case Islam, and gives it protection from criticism. as opposed to what we have in the American legal system, which is defamation protections to individuals or groups of individuals. So you have defamation of an idea or a religion versus defamation of people. Additionally, in the US system, in order for a comment to be defamatory, the statement has to be a false statement of fact. Truth is a defense. So if you say something bad about somebody in America, no matter how terrible it is, if it's true or mere opinion, it's not defamation. By stark contrast, the OIC's definition of defamation includes anything that sheds a negative light on Islam or Muslims, even if it's true and even if it's opinion. Taking that a step further, it also includes anything that violates Islamic blasphemy codes. For example, in Islam, it's prohibited to draw depictions of the Muslim prophet Muhammad. If you do that, even if you show him in a positive light, that's blasphemy in Islam, and the OIC would consider it defamation as well. And though this resolution is called defamation of religions, in the OIC's interpretation and implementation, it applies only to Islam. There is absolutely no reciprocity for anti-Jewish, anti-Christian, or anti-Israel hate speech. Indeed, the OIC supports Hamas, it supports Iran's nuclear program, and it rationalizes 9/11. And though UN resolutions are not considered binding law, they do carry a lot of political significance and weight. The more frequently a resolution is passed, or if it's passed in various UN bodies, then the more significance and political weight is given to those ideas embodied in that resolution. This resolution was initially introduced in 1999 in what was then called the Commission on Human Rights. In 2005, a similar resolution was passed in the General Assembly. When the Commission on Human Rights folded in 2005 and popped back up in 2006 under the new name of the Human Rights Council, or HRC for short, it was introduced and passed there as well. It passed every single year in all three of these bodies since its initial introduction. 2008 was the first year that the resolution was in any jeopardy of not getting passed, but the OIC had launched a very aggressive Islamophobia campaign to ensure that it would. Starting a few years back, it held a summit, and then later it held another summit, and at those summits, it established the existence of Islamophobia and asserted that they would have a zero tolerance for it. They said they were going to defend themselves against all free expression that they deemed to be Islamophobic, including hostile glances. They also unveiled their first OIC observatory report. This consisted of 58 pages of real, feigned, claimed, or imagined incidents of Islamophobia. They now produce this report annually, and they also produce a monthly bulletin on Islamophobia as well. I got a copy of the first annual report and some of the monthly bulletins, and was very surprised to find that approximately half of the incidents listed were not bad things that non-Muslims were doing to Muslims, but bad things that Muslims were doing to non-Muslims. Well, how can this be? If you remember what I said before, that their definition of Islamophobia includes accurate reports, the veracity of which are not in dispute, so long as it sheds a negative light on Islam or Muslims, then it'll make more sense. They also targeted cartoonists, reporters, governments, and reporters and film producers. The media also takes the numbers from the statistics provided by the OIC, as well as other Islamophobia tracking organizations, and repeats them without checking into the nature of the claims. And the numbers alone can be quite alarming. I'm going to give you a few examples that I pulled out of those early reports so you can see what kinds of things the OIC labels as Islamophobia. In 2008, the country of Qatar opened its first Christian church. Muslims protested on the street. Arabic papers wrote articles saying that Christians ought not have the right to erect a house of worship in a Muslim-majority country. One English language publication translated one of those articles, and that translation and republication was Islamophobic. It's Islamophobic that Wikipedia refused to remove depictions of the Muslim prophet Muhammad from its English language website. That was Islamophobic. And it was Islamophobic when the EU asked Iran to drop the death penalty for the crime of apostasy. The OIC repeatedly asserts that Islamophobia is one of the greatest threats to world peace and global security, rather than concluding that perhaps Islamophobia is the result of the actions taken by a radical Islamist movement around the globe. As a result of this victimhood campaign, because that's what the Islamophobia campaign was, this resolution passed yet again in 2008, although this time with declining support. Shortly thereafter, in the Human Rights Council, they implemented a rule that said nobody can come before this body and, quote, judge or evaluate a religion. The International Humanist Ethical Union raised for consideration before the Human Rights Council violence against women in a lot of the Muslim countries, including honor killings, stonings for adultery, female genital mutilation, and forced marriages of little girls, sometimes as young as age 9. They were told that these practices are permissible under Sharia law, and therefore they can't discuss it, because to do so would be to judge or evaluate a religion. So, it appears that all human rights abuses, which are permissible under Sharia law, can no longer be discussed in the Human Rights Council, the body which was purportedly designed to address human rights. At a certain point, the State Department realized that this resolution had potentially dire consequences for freedom of expression. So in 2011, they asked the OIC to draft an alternative resolution which would retain freedom of expression and still address the OIC's concerns of alleged Islamophobia. The result was Resolution 1618 to combat intolerance based on religion or belief. Actually has a much longer title, but we'll leave it at that. This resolution was passed in March of 2011, and it was the first time in 12 years that the OIC did not introduce the defamation of religions resolution. The State Department and many Christian organizations fully supported this new resolution because they believed that this resolution was moving from protecting an idea or a religion to protecting persecuted minorities based on religion or belief, and specifically protecting them from violence or discrimination. So what could be wrong with that? Well, let's look at it a little bit more closely. The new resolution does drop the language defamation of religions and instead focuses on intolerance, discrimination, and incitement to violence based on religion or belief. But the language was still open to interpretation and problematic, and I'll focus today on only 3 of the clauses. First, it discourages, quote, religious profiling for purposes of law enforcement. So how does the resolution define religious profiling? It is, quote, the invidious use of religion as a criterion for purposes of interrogations, questioning, investigations, and searches, unquote. So notice, this resolution isn't saying that you can't use religious profiling as the sole criterion. In other words, no one's saying, oh, you're Muslim, let's lock you up, and this resolution is trying to prohibit that. That's not what's happening. This resolution is saying that you can't use religion as one factor on a list of other elements to consider. Second, it condemns the advocacy of religious hatred that amounts to incitement to discrimination, hostility, and violence, unquote, and urges states to take effective action against it. There are numerous problems with this. First, advocacy of religious hatred that amounts to incitement to hostility. What's that? Comes exceedingly close to outlawing hatred, which you might have noticed is an emotion. It also attempts to internationalize the norms of free speech, as does the former resolution, defamation of religions. Both, in America we have the First Amendment that governs our rules of free speech, and other sovereign countries have their own rules governing speech. Both of these resolutions aspire to usurp those rules and supplant them with one single rule across the board. Additionally, there's ample reason to believe that criticism of Islam, in other words, defamation of religions, will constitute the advocacy of religious hatred that amounts to the condemned incitement. The third clause I want to draw to your attention, and this is the one that gets the most attention, is it calls for the criminalization of the imminent incitement to violence. Well, what's wrong with that? We have laws like that in America today. It's illegal, it's criminal to incite imminent violence. Well, guess what? As it turns out, the OIC has a totally different definition of the word incitement than we do here in America. We have what's called a content-based test, and they want a consequence-based test. I'll give you an example. In America, if I say to you, I want you all to get together tomorrow at 2 o'clock and go kill Joe, and then you do that, you will be responsible for murder, and I will be responsible for my comments because the content of my language encouraged or incited the violence. That's a content-based test. The OIC wants a consequence-based test. And the example that they cite most frequently is that of the Danish cartoons. If you recall, in 2006, there was a series of depictions of the Muslim prophet Muhammad, and subsequently, riots ensued all across the Middle East and all across Europe. The Danish embassies were trashed, people were killed, and mayhem ensued. The OIC would say that those riots were the consequence of the cartoons. But I think you'll agree with me when I point out that while the riots were subsequent, there was absolutely nothing inherently consequent about them. And you can see that there are numerous problems with the consequence test. First, it's a retroactive test. If you make a comment, cartoon, or video that happens to be offensive, it's totally legal until later on somebody chooses to respond to it in a violent manner, and then your actions were criminal retroactively. Second, it shifts personal responsibility from the violent actor to the person who made a comment, video, or cartoon that happens to be offensive. If you have the Judeo-Christian values of personal responsibility, where does the responsibility lie? Does it lie with the person who commits violence, or does it lie with the person who makes a comment who might happen to be offensive? Compare that to how Christians responded when they had artwork of a cross put in urine or a painting of the Virgin Mary with cow dung thrown on it in the Brooklyn Museum of Art. They didn't start killing people and rioting and causing property damage. They wrote letters to the editor, they wrote op-eds, and they contacted Mayor Giuliani asking him not to support the Brooklyn Museum with taxpayer dollars. But most importantly, using the consequence test has the effect of enforcing the concept of combating defamation of religions, the exact concept that this resolution was purportedly designed to defeat. It's also important to note that according to the OIC, anybody who, quote, defames Islam is Islamophobic. So in America, when we use that word, people are assuming that it connotes bigotry or prejudice. But when the OIC uses it, it really has a much broader meaning. So in combating intolerance pursuant to Resolution 1618, and what could be more intolerant than being Islamophobic, which some people are equating with racism, sexism, and the like, you're not just protecting Muslims, you're protecting Islam as well. This resolution dropped the language of combating defamation of Islam, but the OIC has made it very clear that it has not dropped its goal to protect Islam from defamation. In 2011, Hillary Clinton attended a high-level diplomatic meeting on Islamophobia, which was held in Istanbul, Turkey. At that meeting, she announced to the world that the State Department would host the first Istanbul conference. Istanbul process is the moving to implementation, Resolution 1618, despite the fact that there's absolutely nothing in the resolution that mandates this, and it's totally contrary to the norm of leaving UN resolutions in the realm of the theoretical. The fact that she announced this legitimized the OIC's positions, and it also signaled to the free world that partnering with the OIC is not only acceptable, but perhaps even desirable. And following America's lead, the EU, which previously made a point to hold the OIC at arm's length, chose to have the following Istanbul conference this past December. The next Istanbul conference is expected to be scheduled for June of 2013. I want to talk to you for a minute about the State Department's Istanbul conference. This conference was held over a 3-day period in December of 2011. Approximately 30 countries and international organizations attended, including the OIC and the EU. During the passage of Resolution 1618, Hillary Clinton said that the passage of this resolution shows that we have, quote, begun to overcome the false divide that pits religious sensitivities against freedom of expression, unquote. But if the State Department really had any concern for retaining free speech, and I believe it did at the time that the resolution was passed, somehow by the time the conference came around, the entire focus moved to protecting religious minorities. More specifically, it focused on protecting Muslims in America and in the West, instead of focusing on the truly persecuted religious minorities in the OIC countries. What about the Coptic Christians in Egypt? What about the Ahmadiyya Muslims in Pakistan? What about the Baha'is in Iran, or the Jews in Saudi Arabia, if there are any? This was not the focus. The focus was on protecting Muslims in the West. And while Hillary Clinton said that she's not going to push for the enactment of speech-restrictive laws, such as European hate speech-style laws, and she extolled the virtues of free speech, she also quickly followed it up by saying that, quote, the U.S. advocates for other measures to achieve the same result. Those other measures included interfaith dialogue and, quote, the good old-fashioned techniques of peer pressure and shaming, unquote. Hillary Clinton seems to have a fundamental misunderstanding of the principles underlying the First Amendment. The First Amendment was designed to encourage robust political debate and to flesh out minority viewpoints. It wasn't intended for some people to use their free speech rights to tell other people to shut up, because that's a more effective means of silencing them than passing speech-restrictive laws. I assume that most of you in this audience support the notion of free speech. But even if you don't, I ask you, is it the proper role of the State Department to use peer pressure and shaming to silence the speech of Americans with whom it disagrees? I think not. Secretary Clinton says that she wants to, quote, bridge the divide that separates different faiths and different cultures. The problem is the bridge of tolerance flows in only one direction, towards the Islamization of the West and the ever-shrinking of free expression. Many people believe that restrictions on free expression won't occur in America because we have the First Amendment. And it's true, we won't lose those freedoms tomorrow. But if you look around the globe and throughout history, you will see that freedom is the exception. It's not the rule. And it can be lost gradually and incrementally. It's not always in a violent coup. If the public is not made aware of the threat and can't name it by name in order to nip it in the bud in its early stages, by the time people wake up, it might be too late. So this is briefly how I see the process of incremental freedom being lost. First, we have people saying we have to have responsible speech, sensitive speech, politically correct speech. In other words, self-censorship. The second stage is when government agencies and institutions such as universities issue speech-restrictive guidelines and policies. And a lot of people don't realize that we have that in our government today, and it's getting worse every year. The FBI, State Department, and National Counterterrorism Center have all issued memos to their national security professionals discouraging them from using words like Islamic terrorism. The National Security Strategy Memo, which is our country's guiding document for our whole country's national security policies, used to say that militant Islam was the greatest ideological threat in the 21st century. Now, that's been deleted, and there is no mention at all of any Islamist ideology. The Department of Homeland Security Advisory Committee, HSAC, makes a concerted effort to say in its recommendations that national security professionals should focus on terrorist behavior and, quote, de-link it from the underlying ideology that motivates it. The next step is civil violations, and Canada is a good example of that. Canada has a constitution that supposedly affords it free speech. Yet, in almost every province, it has human rights commissions that on a regular and frequent basis issue fines for defaming Islam, even if you didn't defame a person. And by the way, there's a push to start those in America. And the final step is the criminalization of speech. You might have followed the case of Geert Wilders as an example of that. Geert Wilders was a member of parliament in the Netherlands. He has very strong views on Islam, but he's made it clear he has nothing against Muslims, just doesn't like the ideology of Islam. You might not agree with him, but should he be imprisoned for voicing his opinion? Yet that is exactly the possibility that he faced when he had criminal charges pressed against him and had to endure a long, drawn-out trial. In the end, he was acquitted, and many touted that as a victory for free speech. But they were wrong, because the process is still in place, and the mere prosecution sends a chilling effect to those who fear that if they voice their opinion, they will have to face that process and perhaps wind up with a different result. And it's very important to note that the language under which he was prosecuted in the Dutch Penal Code is very similar to the language of Resolution 1618. It was incitement to hatred language. I'm going to give you a few examples of how the concept of defamation of religions is playing out in everyday life. I want to be clear, I am not saying that these examples are a direct result of the UN resolutions or even of the OIC. Why? Because unfortunately there are numerous Islamist organizations in this country and the West who are fighting hard to protect Islam from defamation using different goals. So these are just examples of how that concept is playing out. First, defamation of religions has a chilling effect on speech and authorship in all quarters of life, from the workplace to the public sphere. You can no longer criticize Islamic terrorism, Islamic human rights violations, or Islamic persecution of religious minorities without being slapped with the label Islamophobe. If you live in Europe, most countries there have some sort of hate speech laws that serve as proxies for Islamic blasphemy laws by providing deterrent punishments for insulting Islam. In America, there are books or events with speakers, authors, and prayer leaders who want to address these issues, and they are being canceled with increasing frequency. Even TV shows and films have been altered. Corporations are changing their products, their package designs, and their production procedures in response to pressure to address Islamic issues and ensure they don't defame Islam. And in some cases, due to fear of lawsuits, employers are giving special preferences to Muslims, basically exempting them from the laws under which the rest of us have to live. If you're interested in this subject, Google what's going on with EEOC claims in Minnesota. The FBI, the Department of Justice, the Department of Homeland Security, and the National Counterterrorism Center have all rewritten their training materials in the last year for intelligence and national security professionals, deleting all mention of Islamic terrorism. Trainers who used to teach counterterrorism training programs for years and years and years can't teach them about Islamic terrorism anymore. If they mention it, they were considered Islamophobic, and they are no longer invited back. In other words, government agencies funded with your taxpayer dollars are working hard to protect Islam from defamation at the expense of protecting you. And finally, just to show you how far the government's position has shifted over the years ago, when we signed a UN resolution that had a clause that had a speech restriction in it, we signed what's called a reservation, basically opting out of that clause. So in other words, we were saying that we'll sign on to this whole resolution except for that clause because we insisted that Americans retain our First Amendment freedoms to free expression. Yet now we have the State Department spearheading the effort to implement that very same language that the government previously disavowed. Finally, we have the Benghazi fiasco. As you all know by now, the terrorist attacks in Benghazi were committed by an al-Qaeda affiliate, and they were not the result of a spontaneous uprising, as the administration initially claimed. So there are numerous issues regarding this. One is what were they doing? Two is why were they covering it up? But there's also the issue of the means of the cover-up. Why is it that they chose to condemn an obscure anti-Islam 14-minute video trailer as the means of the cover-up? I believe it was to appease the Muslim world and to show them that America, too, is working hard to protect Islam from defamation. If you recall, in his 2009 speech in Cairo, the president said, quote, "It is my job as president of the United States to fight stereotypes of Islam, not of Muslims, of Islam, wherever they might be." And that is exactly what this administration is doing. The Founding Fathers drafted the First Amendment in part to protect offensive speech. The way to counter bad ideas is with good ideas. Instead of allowing the OIC's ideology to influence the State Department in America, America should be leading the charge to establish freedom of speech worldwide, equivalent to that of the United States Constitution's First Amendment. We should be condemning the persecution of religious minorities and the human rights violations of the OIC countries to whom we're currently capitulating, including Saudi Arabia and Iran. And above all, and I can't stress this enough, we have to understand that free speech constitutes a human right. Its restriction in the form of combating defamation of religions does not. Only people should be afforded human rights. Ideas, policies, and religions ought not get protection from criticism because the OIC is trying to assert the combating defamation of religions as a human right. Additionally, it's important to understand that the constitutional concept of religious freedom bears absolutely no resemblance whatever to the OIC's notion of combating defamation of religions. Religious freedom is an individual right. It is the right of an individual to freely practice his faith. It is not the right of a religion to be free from criticism. Resolutions like the ones I've discussed with you today harm free speech rights, they harm religious freedom rights, they harm human rights, they harm national security, and they harm terrorism prevention efforts. Yet, the OIC uses cries of Islamophobia to gain sympathy and support for its anti-freedom measures. In conclusion, I want to say that we cannot allow the OIC to take the shield of religious freedom and use it as a sword of state censorship. America is the last bastion of freedom and the hope of all men living under tyranny and oppression. We should be holding ourselves up as a role model for freedom, equality, and human rights instead of exalting the Islamist enemies of freedom that constitute the Organization of Islamic Cooperation.